So the Chinese Mid-Autumn Festival, also known as the Mooncake Festival, is coming up, in which families get together and, amongst other things, eat mooncakes. Traditional mooncakes are filled with either lotus root or red bean paste. They're wrapped in a pastry shell and stamped with these pretty patterns. Lately, more and more companies are making mooncakes with modern, interesting flavors. So this week I decided I'd try and make mooncakes out of black sesame ice cream with a soft mochi shell. So I'll get started by making the ice cream, which is a pretty standard ice cream recipe. First I'll take 300 milliliters of heavy cream, throw that in a pot, along with 100 grams of sugar. And I'll heat those up together until the sugar dissolves. Next I'll add in some vanilla bean, and then the black sesame. I'm going to use about 50 grams of those, and I want to toast them to bring out their nutty flavor. Just keep that going over low heat, stirring frequently until you start hearing some crackling. By the way, they also make black sesame powder, but I want to show you guys how to make it from scratch. So once that's toasted, I'll add it into my food processor and puree that until it's as powdered as I can get it. I'll add those into the cream, stir them around, let them infuse for a few minutes. Then I'm going to remove the cream from the heat and put it in a pot of ice to cool it down rapidly. Once it's cool to the touch, I can assemble my ice cream maker. And I finally figured out that gasket on top. It attaches to the cylinder, not the outer case. So I'll pour in the cream. Throw on the cover. And crank that every few minutes until it turns into ice cream. Now, I must not have frozen my cylinder long enough because this ice cream didn't really come together. It got thicker, but it stayed runny, so I transferred it to some jars and threw it in the freezer overnight to set up. While that was freezing, I turned my attention to the mochi. Now, at first I wanted to do a more traditional mochi recipe, so I looked up a few and here's what I came up with. Took 50 grams of this mochiko powder, and added water little by little. Until it turned into a firm but pliable dough. Next up, I heated up some water in a pot. And once it was boiling, I put my mochi in a steamer basket on top and let that go for about 20 minutes. Now after 20 minutes it looked beautiful and bouncy, but it would have been missing sweetness, so the recipe I followed called for an equal amount of sugar to mochi. It seemed like a lot, but I dumped it in thirds and mixed that together with the mochi over low heat. Took a while to fully incorporate, but eventually the sugar does melt and blend right in. Now to roll out the mochi, I dusted a work surface with cornstarch and dumped out the mochi. And immediately I could tell the texture was off. It wasn't bouncy, it wasn't stretchy, it was kind of grainy. I wasn't sure what caused that, but I thought maybe the sugar had cooked too much and turned into crystals. So I tried out a second batch using the same steps, but this time no heat under the pot as I was mixing in the sugar. The mochi has a lot of heat trapped inside of it, so I didn't think that would be a problem. And this round worked a lot better. It had a little bit of bounce to it. It was no longer as grainy and crumbly as before, but it was still kind of unwieldy to work with. It didn't want to stick together. So I did my best to roll it out into a thin sheet. Cut out a square. And dumped in a dollop of ice cream. Now, two unfortunate things happened at this stage. My ice cream wasn't fully frozen, so it immediately melted the second it hit the slightly warm mochi. And like I said, the mochi didn't want to stick together, so wrapping the ice cream inside of it was pretty much impossible. So new day, new shirt, and I decided to try a different recipe altogether. This is based on a number of mochi mooncake recipes, which I should have looked for at the start. Would have made a lot more sense than looking up mochi on its own and trying to work it out. Regardless, this calls for the powdered sugar and the mochi coil to be sipped together at the beginning. And it uses a combination of milk and oil as the liquid instead of water. Now immediately you can see the texture is totally different. It stays as a liquid. So we pour that into a bowl in the steamer basket and steam it for 30 minutes this time until it firms up. Now another huge missing element from the other recipes was kneading. Traditionally mochi would be beaten with big hammers until it gets soft and squishy. So I threw this into my stand mixer along with a hook attachment at first, which ended up not being long enough to touch the bottom of the bowl. So I switched to the paddle attachment and left that to knead for about 5 minutes. And this looks way better. It's still got its bounce, it's much smoother, much softer, but it's too hot and sticky to work with right now, so I transferred it to some plastic wrap. Threw it in the fridge, and let it cool down overnight. The next day I cut this into 25-gram pieces, rolled those into balls, then roll them out into sort of dumpling wrappers. Then I filled each one with an equal amount of ice cream. And wrapped them pretty much like a soup dumpling. Now the ice cream was starting to melt again, and I want these to really firm up so I can press out that fancy shape. So I threw them on a plate, popped them in the freezer, and let them firm up for a couple hours. Unfortunately, my freezer wasn't fast enough to freeze them in shape, so they kind of settled into these little flat hockey pucks. But they'll still taste good, and after all this effort, I didn't want to have to go through all the steps all over again just to make them look pretty. So I got out my mooncake mold, and the square one didn't quite press them into a square shape. So I'm going with the round one just to be easier. Press real hard. And, you know, it sort of worked. It's got a nice little pattern on top. The bottom doesn't look great, but be honest, if somebody offers you some ice cream, you take it, don't you? And honestly, flavor and texture-wise, these turned out perfectly. The mochi is nice and soft, it's got a little bit of sweetness from the sugar, and the black sesame ice cream is so nutty and sweet, it's just one of my favorites. So I hope this gives you some fun ideas, hope this gives you some insight into some of the madness that we food tubers go through sometimes just to get a recipe out. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the recipe, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.